I'm going to be talking to you about today is using the arts as the best catalyst for sustainable societies, and the idea that the arts can save the world. And this is based off of a lot of new research that we've been involved with, both here at York and then through various partners, that's been looking at the various things that we can actually measure within the different areas of sustainable development and how they come together well through the infrastructure of the arts. So the first thing that I want to do, and this might be familiar for many, is to just sort of set the ground rules for what I mean when I'm saying sustainability. This became very important to us through the center and when we talk about it within York, to make sure that we're all on the same page here. So coming out of the UN definition, the Brundtland Commission, we're talking about the accelerating deterioration of the human environment and natural resources, the consequences of that deterioration for economic and social development. And we're talking about development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. This is our working definition that we're using. And from this, and from the documentation that came with this, we have what many people will recognize through many different terms. I prefer the idea of them being 3 dimensions. People will call them the 3 legs of the sustainability stool, the triple bottom line, etc. That you've got the environmental, the economic, and the socio-political impacts that you're talking about. And 2 other ideas that are intrinsic to what I'll be showing you are systems thinking, the idea of the influence of one part within an entire whole. If you have a sense of ecosystems, this is that same idea that it's an interrelated system and that we need to look at the arts within society and within their environment in that same way, not just as an isolated industry or field. And then also the idea of wicked problems, which relates back to this idea of systems thinking. Wicked problems that in and of themselves are not necessarily evil, but are resistant to their resolution. They're just extremely complicated and makes them hard to solve. As an example of that, this is New Orleans flooded post-Katrina. And there are a number of factors that played into this as the level of tragedy that it became. There was, of course, the hurricane itself, not being prepared for that strength of weather event. And that got into engineering within levees of being a sub-sea level city. It had to do with funding models. It had to do with political structures. It had to do with corruption. It had to do with racial tensions. And all of those issues combined together actually created the size of the issue that came there. But I want to talk about how this then plays out within arts and culture, and not specifically. I mean, we could talk about the arts and culture in New Orleans, the great and rich history, but I want to talk a little bit more globally. And in taking these 3 different areas, I sort of want to work backwards through them. So I'm going to start with the socio-political within here, or the social aspects of it. In his 2010 book, No Culture, No Future, Simon Brault, who is the vice chair of the Canada Council on the Arts and CEO of the National Theatre School in Montreal, I pointed out that we are more and more convinced that culture attracts, sells, brings people together, entertains, appeals, and impresses. But it allows us to bridge the gap between local and international, the specific and the universal. It allows us to exchange and share, counting on the possibility of a dialogue that transcends language and imperfect translations, as well as codes, beliefs, religions, and differences of all manner. And this is something that we sort of feel. This is why we're attracted to the arts. But it wasn't until about 2004 when the RAND Corporation came out with Gifts of the Muse, a study that they did looking at the idea of instrumental versus intrinsic impacts, social impacts of the arts, and why we might be looking at the wrong thing within this context. So when I'm talking about instrumental benefits, these are things that you might have seen in defense of supporting the arts that are great things that say this is why we should have arts in the school, this is why we should have arts in our communities, and these include things like improved test scores, self-efficacy, learning skills, health, and development of social capital. Within the cognitive realm, people will point to studies that show rising test scores for those who have access to arts education, improved basic reading skills, and improved basic skills in reading, mathematics, and creative thinking. You'll see attitudinal and behavioral improvements between self-discipline. You see more frequent school attendance, reduced dropout rates, development of life skills, and within health, the benefits of art as a source of therapy, of supporting mental and physical health, the reduction of stress and anxiety as well. There are some issues with this, though. The critiques that have come out of this and are highlighted within, starting within that RAND study, is that there's a sort of weakness in the empirical models. There's a little bit, and this is actually how they get undermined when we're talking about supporting the arts within schools or within our communities for these instrumental reasons, in that the actual data is more about a correlation between those who have arts education are also showing these improvements. But there hasn't necessarily been really great information about the direct impact between the two. So we know that there's an improvement, but we can't for sure say that because we're doing arts education or therapy, that this is necessarily the best thing that leads to these outcomes. But these outcomes do improve where arts education, arts therapy in our schools and communities do exist. So there's a little bit of an issue there. Still great impacts as they've been measured. But what's highlighted within that RAND study is that though these are important, people are drawn to the arts not for these effects. This isn't why we are interested in going to a play or going to the museum. But the arts can provide people with meaning and with a distinctive type of pleasure and emotional stimulation that isn't otherwise present in their day-to-day lives. And this gets into what we've started to measure, which is around the ideas of intrinsic benefits. So this is things like captivation, pleasure, expanded capacity for empathy, creation of social bonds, and expression of community meaning or community building. In a study that came out last year, Wolf Brown, which is a consultancy that does a lot of great work around studying the arts within North America and its impacts, they looked at the intrinsic impact of live theater across a number of nonprofit theaters. This is a play called Ruined by Lynn Nottage. It's about the impact of war in the Democratic Republic of Congo on among women within the country, and they looked at two different productions on different sides of the United States. And they looked at one at Berkeley Rep in the San Francisco Bay Area, and another one at Arena Stage, which is in Washington, D.C. And when looking at these, they found that the audience that were compelled to participate in it, either attending it or attending additional activities around it, tended to be attracted to it based off of the content that was in it, the discussions that were being prompted. The same sort of thing happened with a production called Let Me Down Easy. Anna Devereaux Smith did the same production in both locations as well about end-of-life care and dealing with terminal illness as a documentary theater piece that she did as a solo work. And we saw the same sort of effects. Each of these works were appealing to specific populations, either because of their interest in the topic, because of their personal connections to the topic, either through familiar bonds, community bonds, etc. And that this increased the perceived impact of this. In fact, 30%, 1/3 of attendees who left a performance with unanswered questions were able to articulate those questions, which has been denoted as a way of saying that somebody was able to invest within the work itself, versus other productions, which another example that they used was both theaters did productions of work by Tennessee Williams, part of the American canon of dramatic literature, but did not necessarily have the same depth of impact and the same identity and the same attraction, even though it had the name recognition between the authorship, the direction, and any of the talent involved would otherwise be the same. And so that there was a doubling of the perceived value of the performance, whether or not this was couched in economic terms or just in personal valuation, based off of the story and the connection to the content that was in there versus familiarity with anything that was happening with it. So that's one side of this coin. On the other side, and this just came out this last summer, again from the Bay Area, there's a lot of great research that happens around the arts in the Bay Area. The Arts Diversity Index, which took a look, instead of moving away from the impact that people had, but looking at how does the work that's being created within a community reflect that community. They did identify that most theater goers in the San Francisco Bay Area tend to be married, affluent, white, educated males. And there's a lot of correlation between different sort of connections within there. But what they did at the same time, and this was the interesting part, that was the first thing, was to compare this with the actual census data of who is in the community. And the reason for doing this is not to say, like, we've got a problem, we're only getting this one psycho and demographic into our theaters, but here's who we're not getting into our theaters. And now that if we combine this with the impact that we know intrinsically that we're starting to see coming out of these other aspects based off a connection to what's happening within it, that if we start thinking about the work that's being produced along those same lines of who do we want to have participate within our theater, within our museum, and not who do we want to come in because they're going to be donors, but because that is the community in which we exist, in which we create work, then they now have different ways and different methodologies for examining that and reflecting that community, which through that intrinsic work, which I'm giving you very little information about, I realize, but through that study around the intrinsic work is looking at the ways that communities reify themselves, that individuals reify themselves within those communities, and identify themselves as part of a social fabric. And the arts become a very instrumental part for that within any sort of social structure that you want to highlight within there. In fact, this is something that is already embedded within the funding for arts granting at a public level, at a federal level, here in Canada. This is from Canada Council for the Arts information about why they're investing and the impact of the arts. And they're looking at aspects of local identity and image and social cohesion within there, which all relates back to these same ideas. And so these are the outcomes that are being reflected within this research that's happening around intrinsic impact versus instrumental impact. So what we're seeing is we're gathering empirical data that reflects the arts serve as a demonstrable community and social value building tool. And that brings us to the economic part of it. There's actually a lot of documentation about this. It's probably the most well-documented part of it because it's the easiest to define. And when you're talking about funding, it's what funding agencies want to see and what they need to represent to the larger governmental bodies that are allocating the funds for those organizations. So we're going to be talking pretty much about the Canadian dollar for a second. Arts spending here in Canada, publicly, the arts are funded at all levels, so municipal, provincial, federal, at about $9.2 billion per year. If you also combine in the private contributions to this, so this is individual giving, this is private foundations, you're looking at an additional $27.4 billion. The effect of this investment in the arts leads to about $46 billion of annual activity. And this goes into everything from revenue, so in the form of taxes, et cetera, coming into various government organizations, and the spending within various areas as well. There's the average amount of money spent within a community in addition to the purchase of a ticket tends to be about $26.50. And all of this direct impact represents about 3.8% of total GDP. And if you add in the indirect amount, so all of the parking, all of the drinks that you gather outside of it, you're actually looking at an economic activity of about $84.6 billion, or about 7.4% of GDP. So what we're looking at here is that when the government or anybody is investing within the arts by funding it, that you're actually seeing within a systematic improvement, an ROI that would make just about anybody jealous. As opposed to where it gets tricky is that you're not just looking at widgets. You're not just we've invested in this widget, we've produced it, we're going to sell it, and we have this percentage of increase as our profit potential. But this is looking at, by putting money out there for the creation of work, by gathering people together in communities, by having that social support, that we see significant returns on investment at a public, for the general public from the funding that comes into the arts. Within the United States, which you'll notice actually spends a lot less on the arts. For a country that has nearly 1/10 the population, they spend less than half on all levels of government in arts allocations. But it still leads to over $130 billion in economic activity. 61.1 billion of that is just by the organizations themselves. So this is tax revenue for people who work for arts organizations. This is spendings on productions and raw materials that go into arts creation. And then $74.1 billion in event-related expenditures. Things that people either go out to eat, grab a drink, pay for parking, etc. And that of all of that money that comes in, $22 billion of that comes in as revenue at the local, state, and federal levels. So again, you're looking at 5 times the amount coming in as that's going out compared to that. So we have a very strong case that the impact of the arts, which is growing, based off of theater facts here, we see that ticket sales are up since 2008. Employment has increased within the arts over the last year significantly. And the number of paid artists working within the theater fields has increased by nearly 5% since 2008. So we see an economic engine at work here that is showing that significant investment within the arts does come back into supporting the communities and societies in which it's embedded. So moving on to that third leg, and we're going to combine these together in a moment. When we look at the environmental impacts of arts production, there are a number of different ways of addressing this. And I'm going to go over some things that may be very familiar. For instance, LEED certification, something that a lot of arts facilities, and actually many municipalities at this point, because of building code, you nearly need to meet some level of LEED certification for the new facilities being created and facilities being renovated. This is the interior of the lobby of Portland Center Stage in Portland, Oregon, the first LEED Platinum certified theatrical facility. It's got great things like access to natural light, passive heating and cooling, very efficient energy business management system, etc. Moving from this doesn't necessarily take care of the work that's being created as well. This has been one of the issues around, should we be looking at the arts in terms of its environmental impact? This is very new research that is really just sort of the first studies coming out of this in 2007, 2008. The Oregon Museum of Science and Industry looked at LEED and said, we want to come up with something for exhibitions, and took a look at what is specified within LEED certification and move that into something, I don't expect you to remember all of this, but giving you a sense of the catalog of different things that they're looking at in a simplified way for certification within a museum environment. But you've got things happening in the creation of the work as well. You can do lots of things to your facilities and lots of things to the way that you create work, but we have to look at the work itself. One of the areas in which live performance has been heavily critiqued is around its use of very energy-intensive lighting fixtures. Things are very bright on stage. Without necessarily compromising on artistic vision, Radiohead, in a decision that they wanted to create the most energy-efficient production that they could for their In Rainbows tour in 2008, changed everything over to low-emitting, low-energy LED fixtures, reduced through strategic planning, reduced their effective carbon by planning ahead for sea freight, so by sending things and creating that logistic map, by instituting carpooling car parks, so giving preferred parking where that was one of the primary modes of transportation when they reached a specific tour stop, and moving over to biofuels for their tour buses. All these things are great, but at this point, they started taking action without necessarily measuring things. The Arcola Theatre, which is based in London, England, decided that they were going to start embedding research within their model and within their production model. So it helps that their general manager is actually a chemist with his PhD who focuses on fuel cell technology. And he says, I want to embed all of this within what we're doing, because what I like about working in the arts is that people are always doing things. It's always about making things, and I want to make things and research at the same time. And one of the products that that their research developed was a portable hydrogen fuel cell for event production here. It's it's this fancy box right here, that tours with specific lighting packages. They've partnered with lighting distributors throughout the UK to put this out into operation, to look at how can we reduce the number of diesel generators that we've observed are out there for either tours, for concerts, for remote productions that are going out into large open spaces to collect people together. They've partnered with an organization called Julie's Bicycle, which is one of the premier research organizations out looking at the environmental impact of the arts. They started within the music industry, primarily looking at how can we reduce carbon due to packaging, have moved into tour, and then were asked to look at this in terms of theater production as well. So primarily looking at live performance and recorded media as well. And they developed tools specifically within the arts to measure carbon. This is just a small screenshot of their IG tools. The IG tools are a customized carbon calculator, which has been developed in partnership with Oxford, and their SMeasure tools, which are for more general use, and made it so that any small to large arts organization can calculate their carbon footprint based off of measuring various specific details within there. And their goal has been to find out where the arts actually are. Because of all these things that we've looked at, we've seen buildings that have improved their environmental footprint. We've seen tours that have tried to improve their environmental footprint. But all of these were done without necessarily knowing what they were improving upon. And this is what's become really exciting to me, actually, most recently, is that now Julie's Bicycle is working with Arts Council England, which requires environmental reporting for all of their grantees. So every arts organization within England is required to fill this out. So they now have information about how arts organizations use their buildings. It's a very specialized industry. It tends to be very energy intensive at very specific periods of time. And when most people interact with these organizations, that specific period of time is generally when they're there. It's when a show is happening, or when an exhibition is open, and you have the most number of people in the audience, and you need are the most resource intensive within there. So we started doing this research around, okay, what are the actual impacts of creating performance work? This is a show from 2005, actually, and this is a complicated sheet. I just want to share it. What we started looking at is like, based off of the information that we have, the connected load of this show, can we figure out the equivalence, and this is based off of EPA calculators, just brought into one sheet, can we find equivalents that are out there so that we can start talking about what we actually are reducing before just trying to improve things, and then once someone actually asks us to improve our theater performance, we've gone so far that there's just not that much room to go. So to distill what this whole sheet, the sheet right here, down to a little bit more digestible, is that the actual production here, and this is a significant amount of electricity, is looking at 131 kilowatts, and this is not a particularly large show. If you went to Cannes Stage here in Toronto, this would be sort of the middle range of where they'd hit within their productions. At the time of its creation, we were looking at, if we decided let's create a commercial solar solution for powering this theater, specifically for its peak usage, we were looking at a significant price tag in US dollars. And we were looking at, over the course of the show, both per hour and life of the show, based off of when it's running, when it's rehearsing, etc., lots of emissions within there. And sequester trees. The number of trees we'd have to plant and let grow for 10 years before we'd be able to offset the carbon that was being emitted from the power generation associated with this production. But what became really interesting was when we started looking at homes, both electricity and aggregate energy, so looking at natural gas and all sorts of different things coming into the home, that we actually found that if we sold out this performance, and this performance was fitting into an area where it was very specifically tailored to the demo and psychographics that in the community that it represented. So it actually was very successful at filling its house and having conversation come out of it itself. That even with every single one of the lights turned on for the entire performance, an hour before, an hour after, that in that same period of time, it was 17% less energy than would be used by the audience at home. And this made us start thinking about, well, what is the actual usage of it? And we just completed a study with Seattle Rep, because they were redoing all their facilities at the campus in downtown Seattle, that has recently been renovated. And we put in systems that said we want to track the actual usage of it. And what we found within this, and what you're seeing here, is over the course of a season, we have the full season for Seattle Rep now, that this is the peaks and valleys of the electrical usage during the show. What's important here, and why I didn't add too much detail in here, is that that peak number, the one that we used in that previous calculation, is whatever is up here. That's your maximum value. And that's not even the entire connected load, everything that's connected to the system. What we found is that the actual electrical consumption compared to what people were using at home was about 15%. So about 85% less by congregating people together for cultural activity. So we've got these different aspects of the different parts of sustainability coming together. And even with the permanent collection example, the one where we first started looking at a connected load through energy, we know that that's something that's going to be, that's going to also have many of those intrinsic benefits that we're looking at socially. So we're seeing that because of the congregating of people together, that cultural activity actually represents a significant reduction in consumption in that time period there. And that instead of necessarily looking at theater as, or exhibition, or any sort of event-based artistic production as a time when we're over-consuming for all those people together, that actually that activity is much more efficient than if we just told people not to come. So we're seeing that environmental benefit. We already know that there's an economic benefit that by investing within these arts based off of the money that then goes into the communities in which the work is created and then back through tax revenue into local, provincial, or state and federal coffers, that there's a significant economic improvement caused by artistic production. And we know that we're starting to gather that empirical data that is looking at the arts as one of the best catalysts for community reification and building identity and becoming a hub. So then we have to ask the question of what is the importance of arts and culture? And if there is a cultural offset, which is a term that we started using. I think it's a little bit problematic, but it's the idea of congregating everybody together and all of these complementary beneficial effects that are positive impacts within the realm of this sustainability question of what are those together and how do they combine together. A study that we did at the Fusebox Festival in 2011 was looking at audience interaction over a 2-week period. We came up with some really lovely infographics. What you're looking at here is a period of 12 hours over the course of the festival, starting at noon and going until midnight, and the density of participation within the festival. So we just counted where everybody was who was participating in the festival, combining through box office information, through people being on site to count individuals coming through the door, et cetera, and put that together so that people were dropping in and out of the system. So we could get a sense of the size of the social impact of congregating people together throughout the city of Austin over the course of the day. We also, and I realize this is small, but what's important is looking at the comparative green to brown within here, is that we calculated based off of all of the audience travel and all of the production that was going on at that time. The brown is the effective carbon generated by producing the festival, with the green being the local economic impact for it. Whether or not we sort of took a chance in putting them right next to each other in this. They're not necessarily meant to offset each other, but they're meant to be looked at the same time, that what is the perceived value in here? What you can't see here because it's way too small is the actual, if you were to look at offsetting all of the carbon represented here through a carbon market, there's a very thin black line that is positive along the same axis as the economic impact that you actually can't see at this scale. That is the cost for trading that carbon. So though there are problems with carbon markets, we're not necessarily saying, oh, just offset everything and you'll be all right. But looking at those, if you're gonna put it in dollar terms, here's the impact of this festival on this community in Austin, Texas, and here is the impact that it would have on the festival of taking that and reinvesting it within some sort of way of offsetting the equivalent amount of carbon that has been generated through all of their activity. People flying in, people turning on lights. And though it's a little bit hard to see here, this also turned into, and what we tend to pride ourselves in doing, is making art about data about art, is created an installation within the festival hub that was updated every day with the actual impacts that were there. So stimulating the conversation and that community, that intentional community that's come together within the festival environment, having them have that conversation about what their actual impacts are on any given day. The Arcola Theatre, coming back to them for just a moment, they've taken this approach towards community. They've already embedded all of this alternative energy research into their practice, both through, they powered one theater entirely off of hydrogen fuel cells. They asked you not to ask them about the hydrogen process, but that they could place that power cap on what they were doing of 5,000 watts versus the 131,000 that we were looking at before. They were forced to move buildings, and when they did so, that's them doing, they were able to get hundreds of community members because they had so embedded themselves within the work that they were doing, both the attention that they had gotten from their environmental initiatives and the attention they were getting by just creating good work and congregating people together. They became within a, well, now you might say gentrifying, but at the time, in the Dalston area of London, became a source of community identity and improvement. So much so that when they moved from one building to another, the community put on a parade to move all of the office furniture from one space to the next. So instead of hiring movers, they just had people, led by a band, to move everything from one site to another. They had become that embedded within the community. And now they have this lovely new space, all reclaimed materials from within the space from before. There's Toby Johnson in The Painter, a play about Turner. And have been able to really become a guiding light within embedding these different aspects of sustainability in what they're doing. There's a growing section of literature around this coming out of the British Council, linking arts to the environmental and sustainable development. IFICA, which is the International Federation of Arts Councils and Cultural Agencies, have looked at the idea of environmental sustainability as one of their growing mandates. And there's growing literature around the idea of funding arts as an engine of both discussing and exemplifying sustainable practice. So I think with all those informations together and where this research is going, because all this is very new, my personal hope is what I'm going to find is that the arts are going to be one of the best catalysts for sustainable societies because of all those positive impacts that are happening in those different dimensions. And that combined with the fact that there's a growing defense for culture itself as a fourth dimension of sustainability, as a question of what we are sustaining, that it's going to become intrinsic to developing our sustainable societies. So thank you very much.